Ja, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie herzlich zu einer weiteren Folge von ZeKK Live. Heute 45 Minuten mit Professor Frank Clooney aus Harvard, mit dem ich mich jetzt unterhalten werde in der bekannten Weise. Wir werden uns etwas über komparative Theologie austauschen, weil er als Erfinder der komparativen Theologie in der Moderne gilt. Und Sie haben dann nach 30 Minuten die Möglichkeit, auch Fragen an ihn zu stellen, die Sie einfach in den Chat schreiben können, auf Deutsch oder Englisch, ganz wie Sie wollen. Das Gespräch wird jetzt in Englisch sein, aber Sie können dann gerne auch auf Deutsch fragen. Professor Clooney, we are very happy to welcome you. It's an honor and pleasure for us to have you here. And we wanted to start a bit to get to know you as a person in your biography and how you started to do something like comparative theology. And when I look at your biography, it's interesting that you were very young when you went to India for 2 years to teach there, I think with 22 years.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you go there? Did you choose India? Can you tell us something about that?
Yes. So I first say thank you to you, Professor von Stosch, and then for this invitation. I'm very happy to be with you today, and thank you for this opportunity. So to answer your question, I was somewhat surprised myself when I ended up going to India after college, after my BA at age 22. I had become a seminarian. I had entered the Jesuits at 18, and then did my BA studies at Fordham University in New York, philosophy and so on. And I think what happened to me at age 21 or so was a realization that the real important questions in life are not simply those of the Greek tradition, the European tradition, the North American tradition, but are much wider. And then part of the Jesuit training is to do some practical work after philosophy, before theology, to do some teaching or church work or refugee work. And I had the opportunity to stay in New York, where I come from, or to go somewhere else. And I think for a mix of intellectual curiosity and wanting to go somewhere very different, and also a sense of being close to people who are poor, I wanted to go to India. But then it turned out that actually in 73, I was not able to get a visa easily to go to India. So I went to Nepal. I went to Kathmandu. And for me, without any real background, it was an eye-opening experience to be in Kathmandu, up in the mountains. All the boys I taught were Hindu and Buddhist. And right from the start, I found it fascinating, very interesting. And also it both challenged and deepened my sense of being Christian, being Catholic. I was learning from them how to be a better Catholic right from the start.
Okay. Can you give an example for that? How did you learn something about your own Christian faith through the encounter with those Hindus and Buddhists?
I think what impressed me, first of all, was going around the great city of Kathmandu, which in those days particularly was not so crowded or polluted as it might be now. But going for the first time in my life to Hindu temples, Buddhist temples, shrines, going to some of the festivals, was asking me about, do we do these things in Catholic tradition, reminding me of some of my early childhood experiences in church with the festival, the music, the incense, in my early life in Latins, hymns, and so on. So seeing the culture and seeing the living religion asked me about what my religion was and was it still living. And then I remember vividly one example of going outside Kathmandu Valley to a place called Dakshin Kali, where there was a temple for the goddess Kali, where there was animal sacrifice twice a week. And for me, that was both so different, something you only see in the movies, the animals being sacrificed, but it was clearly an ordinary part of people's lives. And I found it fascinating. And then thinking about the goddesses, the goddess Kali, Durga, and so on, it also made me rethink about the Virgin Mary in Catholic tradition. We have such piety for the Virgin Mary, who is not a goddess, and the goddesses are not the Virgin Mary, but this sense of the feminine figure and the importance, I could see it lived out in another culture so far from where I came from.
You're writing a lot on those similarities between Hinduism and Christianity and other Eastern religions. So if you encounter such similarities in rituals, in religious life and practice, what are the feelings what this is causing? Are you like frightened because it's you think, well, that's, I only know that from my tradition, why do they have that as well? Or is it more that you are fascinated and happy to see that? Or is it so different that it's not right to see any similarity here?
I think I always made a distinction between the Buddhist rituals and the Buddhist similarities difference than the Hindu. That for some reason I found the Buddhist slightly more foreign to me, something slightly more different, where I didn't really understand what was going on, the Tibetan monks, the chanting, and so on, was for me felt rather foreign, and I had to learn it. I loved it, respecting it, but it was not really natural. Whereas the Hindu context, I always found more natural, that the similarities reminded me of where I came from, growing up Catholic in New York. And that I think for me, it was a sign, not so much theologically that these are the same, or that, not that, but rather that there's a sense of friendly recognition, that what I found in my own tradition, what I saw the Hindus practicing in their tradition, were somehow friendly to one another. The similarities were enhancing. So as I said at the beginning, I think going to Nepal, India, helped me to rediscover my own Catholicism. Then seeing the rituals, reading the Bhagavad Gita, hearing the chanting, the bhajans, and so on like that, all sort of, for me, was a harmony with my Catholic upbringing. And I never found it frightening. And I know so many young people, this was 73, 74, 75, so many young people from the United States, and I'm sure from Europe as well, going to the East and then becoming Hindu, becoming Buddhist, finding a new teacher, a guru. But for me, maybe it was just my personality, but I was already, as I said, in seminary. I was training to be a Jesuit. It didn't ever make me think I would leave my Catholic faith and go to the other, but it somehow said, I want this to be part of my Catholic faith. And so since 73 until now, 2021, almost 50 years, I've always in some way been studying, thinking about Hindu tradition, and making it in some way part of my life as still a Catholic, still a Jesuit, still a priest. And these things are naturally, they go together. It would be very hard in my life now to separate them out and say, I reject that part and I keep this part. It's sort of like one life at this point.
Mm-hmm. So you learned things which you could integrate in your own Catholic approach. Mm. And when you came back then, your study was kind of trying to make sense of those experiences and bringing them together with your Catholic thought? Or how would you describe what you tried to do then in your intellectual work?
Well, I think when I came back, so in 1975, I came back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am now, to do my seminary studies for ordination, theology study. And coming there, the first problem was that almost none of the other students or faculty had any experience like the experience I had. And going to a truly non-Christian part of the world where Hinduism and Buddhism are alive, most of the others were not unfriendly, but they had no idea. And they were sort of saying it doesn't really matter because we have the Christian faith and we have our values already. So I had to make space in studying theology. I had to start like sticking Hinduism into it and reading things and making the connection. But then being an academic person, to be a professor was my destiny, I think. Going to graduate school, I thought, well, if I study seriously my own Christian tradition and read not only the Bible, but also the great theologians of the Middle Ages and so on like that, modern theologians like Karl Rahner, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and so on, I wanted to do my study of the Hindu traditions deeply also. And that not simply to have an experiential knowledge of Hinduism and then a very educated knowledge of Christianity, but to learn it. So I was able to go University of Chicago to the Indian Studies South Asia department. And there I was able to learn Sanskrit, the classical language, which is connected to Greek and Latin, of course, and then Tamil, the language of South India. And so to start doing the kind of study of the text and the theology in Hinduism that I had already been doing in my Christian tradition.
And at some point then you invented somehow the term comparative theology to characterize what you're doing. The term existed before, but it was not coined in the way as you did it and your school and people who follow this kind of new comparative theology. How did this happen? Why did you find this term? What do you want to express with this term of comparative theology?
Well, it's a bit of a mystery to me. I thought it was simple that when I got to Boston College, the great Catholic university, Jesuit university, in 1984 to teach, there were the professors who were saying that because I had studied Hinduism, I could not be a theologian, that being a theologian had to do with studying the Bible and the Christian tradition. Therefore, I was a comparative religion person. And they thought that was a lesser thing. So better to be a Catholic theologian, lesser thing to be a comparative religion person. And I started arguing with people, the older faculty mainly. Younger faculty were very friendly, but older faculty, that my work is Catholic and theological, just as your work is Catholic and theological. You're reading Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. I'm reading Thomas Aquinas and Shankara, Ramanuja, and so on. And I kept forcing the issue, so I started calling it comparative theology. But I recently found two documents of mine, like applications for grants from before I got to Boston College, even 1978, in which I used the term comparative theology. And I'm not sure why I used it, but I think what it represents for me is that it's 100% theology and very loosely explained faith-seeking understanding, something like that. But it's also interreligious, comparative, cross-religious borders. I think in some cases, I don't object if people say, well, it's really interreligious theology or comparative theology. But the term I used and then found, as you say, there was a 300-year history of the term comparative theology. I think, and certainly in English and French and German, other languages where the term was already being used. But it represents the fact of going out and coming back between traditions. And when I was settling in at Boston College, it helped me to define who I was, that I was not simply the world religions person, but that I was a member of the Catholic faculty, except that my work was seriously engaging, studying the Hinduism.
Can you give an example how your work is theological and not only what a comparativist would do in comparative religion? What would be a genuine theological insight which you got through your encounter with Hinduism?
I think I would say two things. One, the first thing I would say is that I didn't have the kind of insights that you would imagine where you simply add something to the Catholic faith. So we have the Catholic faith and then I'll add this and this and this from Hinduism, stick it on the side or something like that, as if it was additions. But it was the way of saying that we have inquiry, we have intellectual seeking and thinking and questioning about the nature of God, the nature of the incarnation, the nature of revelation, salvation. And then to realize that there were great thinkers in the other traditions thinking and asking some of the similar questions. Why are we alive? What happens after death? Are we to be saved? Is the world a mystery or not? So I tried to formalize some of this in one of my early books called Hindu God, Christian God in 2001, in which I said, let me take up certain themes that are famous in theology. So the existence of God, the name of God, incarnation, revelation, and I took up major Christian thinkers, the Englishman Richard Swinburne from Oxford, and then actually three German thinkers. My German, you can see, is not very good, but I admire greatly the great German thinkers. So Hans Urs von Balthasar, Swiss German, then Karl Rahner, the Jesuit, and Karl Barth. the great evangelical theologian, on these issues and said, if you are interested in reading Rahner or Karl Barth or von Balthasar, then you should be interested in what these great Hindu thinkers said on the same topics, often asking some of the same questions. And so going back and forth in that fashion, basically saying we have an identity, a Catholic identity, we come from a certain background, but the questions we are asking don't stop at the edge of Catholicism. And we realize that in Hinduism, but as you know, Professor, certainly in Islam, there are similar questions, there are historical connections. And for the mind to say, I'm only interested up to this point and then nothing else, seemed to me to be rather a strange way of thinking, that you keep thinking out. And when I did the book, I mentioned the Virgin Mary earlier, Hindu goddesses and the Virgin Mary. A few years later, the idea that there is this feminine central figure. And there's much Catholic theology, of course, about the identity of Mary, her immaculate conception, her virginity at the birth of Jesus, her place in the church. And then to see not the same thing, but how some of the great goddesses like Lakshmi or Sita or Devi have a role to play in Hinduism. When there are male gods, there are great gods like Vishnu, Rama, Shiva, but they choose also to have great goddesses who represent the feminine principle. And again, it's not the same thing exactly, but to see we have God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. And for many Catholics, very, very important is the Virgin Mary. And what is that about? I think I understood it better by studying the Hindu text about the goddesses and then looking back and saying, can I learn from this about how to think about Mary?
So all those examples show very well, and I can also see this in your books, how comparative theology can intensify your own faith and help you to go deeper, have also deeper questions and go back and forth to understand things better. Is there also the experience of rectification, that you learn something which is different and changes your own faith? Would you say this happens as well, or that you learn something from something which is entirely different from what you have in your own approach?
I think, and that's hard to pin down exactly, but I think on the one level, there is a sense that there are always differences, that no matter, I think is when you call yourself a comparative theologian, and I look for points of similarity, I'm also recognizing there are 100 differences, 1,000 differences, and these things are there too. But I think sometimes I run into kinds of thinking in Hinduism that we simply don't see the same thing in the Christian tradition. So I give two examples. One would be, I did my PhD dissertation in Chicago on what's called Purva Mimamsa. And the Mimamsa is a way of kind of legal, ritual reasoning about the Vedic revelation. And it's strictly this kind of legal reasoning that may be closer to what the rabbis did with some of the texts of the Torah. But this close reasoning, elaborate thinking, cases, and so on. And I couldn't find anything like this in Catholic tradition. I looked into canon law and so on like that, but it's not the same thing. And I said to myself, here is this brilliant way of thinking, so analytic, so totally dedicated to revelation, that seems to be unlike anything we have. Can I begin to read the scripture, read the Bible in light of this? So in the book that we did together, How to Do Comparative Theology, my essay in there, I took a really difficult section of the Mimamsa and said, can we even think about this, which is not different because it is mystical or mysterious, but because we don't know why they're interested in that. They're not interested in what we're interested in, and vice versa. I learned from that. The other example is more famous, perhaps, what's called Advaita Vedanta, the non-dualism. So the radical of the teaching of the Upanishads, of Shankara, Ramana Maharshi, the sense that all is absolutely one without difference. And instead of having a sense that we are in relationship to God permanently, the sense that ultimately it's like the river flowing into the ocean, you become the reality of God. God becomes you. And that there's nothing quite that radical, I think, in Christian tradition. People talk about, and you would know perhaps better than I mean, in terms of Meister Eckhart or the sense of Gottheit or something like that, these ultimate mysteries beyond God, the Father, Son, and Spirit. But it seemed that in Hinduism, India, and then parallels in Buddhism, this sense of a sense of pure bliss, consciousness, being that didn't have any exact parallel. And some things like that, I didn't know what to do with them, but I had no reason to condemn them or reject them or forget them. So there are things floating in my mind all the time that they don't fit in, but they don't go away. And I think that's a good way for us to think.
How does this change then your attitude towards theology? There is a debate within comparative theology whether it should be confessional or metaconfessional. And it's a debate, and also you can distinguish scholars whether they work confessionally or metaconfessionally. So I understand your work as a confessional comparative theology, but there's some openness for those things which you don't fit in your own theology.
Yeah.
And sometimes you speak of hybrid theology because of that. How would you what is your position here between those possibilities of doing comparative theology?
Well, I think there has to be the expectation that just as people have different understandings of theology, even aside from comparative work, not all Christian thinkers agree on exactly what theology is. And even among people who only work on Christian history, Christian tradition, some would be confessional and others would be academic professionals who never let you know their faith. Some of that carries over. But there are people like yourself, Catherine Cornell, I try myself to be confessional, that the faith is really part of it, the engagement of faith-seeking faith, faith encountering faith, where there are questions of the believing person that come to the fore. But I think some other people, and I have no terrible objection usually to saying, well, it's an academic discipline in the university. You can compare theologies, you can compare ideas, and so on. And that's possible. And we see at great universities, people who call themselves theologians, and you have no clear understanding what they believe, if anything. And they may be pious believers, but they never talk about it. They just compare. But to your other question, I think being a confessing, believing theologian could be taken to mean that when it comes to anything that doesn't fit the Catholic faith, I reject it, or I leave it out, or I have to critique it. And certainly many of my ancestors, Jesuits who went to India in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, felt it was their job to argue with the Hindus and to prove that the Hindu ideas like rebirth, reincarnation were wrong. And I think maybe the difference for me being maybe obviously born in the 20th century, living in the 21st century, a sense of not denying that there are incompatible differences. So do you believe in reincarnation or not? Do you believe the soul is eternal, or was it created at conception or not? And so on. But my job, I felt, is not then to sit down and argue it through to prove that the Catholic view is correct and their view is incorrect. I've had conversations with Hindu thinkers sometimes where it's clear that we don't see the world the same way. But they know that they come from a Vaishnava background, a Shaiva background. They know I come from a Catholic background. We didn't really expect to believe, to agree. And we see there are differences. And then we simply let the differences be there, but not stand in the way of learning from one another. So
I like that attitude very much, because I think it's very Catholic. It's kind of all comprehensive in the literal term of Catholic, and even trying to comprehend and to include things which I cannot understand at the moment, but doesn't mean that I have to ignore them. One last question from me, and then I will look in the chat. in some younger comparative theologians say it's so important not only to concentrate on text and tell that you are too much just reading text, and we should have this, what Marianne Moyert calls the ritual turn, and looking more at rituals. What would you think of how important is it not only to look at text, and how important texts are for comparative theology? What would you say?
Yeah, I think in some ways that this is an important question. It may be somewhat generational. There are certainly some younger people in the academy who are much more interested in ritual, who are interested in ethnography of field work, interviewing people, going to rituals, going to festivals and so on like that. And they feel somewhat frustrated if they're just asked to read the text. And I can see that it's a good thing. Music, art, dance, sculpture, pilgrimage, and so on, all of that is very good. Even though, ironically, if somebody is talking about ritual or talking about music, they end up writing text. They end up writing about it. And they end up making a book about what is not in the book. And so it ends up being textual anyway. But I think when I started out, and I think I haven't changed that much, it was more or less taken for granted that if you are a theologian, your primary work is to read the text. So it may be the Bible, it may be patristic texts, it may be Aquinas, Augustine, Bonaventure, or modern thinkers, that primarily it was about reading text. And I think I just did the same thing, seeing that many of the Hindus I admired were doing that too, reading the text. But I think also, I mean, both of us, I think, would agree that being Catholic, you realize that there's more to being Catholic than the text, that even the Bible, it's proclaimed, you hear it in church, you pray with it, you see it acted out in Lent, Easter, Christmas, and so on. It's surrounded by traditions. I think I take for granted that the text is not simply the book by itself, but the book in the community, the book in tradition, and people use the book. But Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Christianity, Judaism never put the book aside and say it doesn't matter, but rather it's part of who we are. But you have to let it come alive and be part of a living tradition, not simply books on a shelf.
Thank you so much. We have some questions in the chat now, and I will read them to you, or start with the first one. Was it only the rituals and the Buddhist tradition which made you feel foreign to that religion? Or did the huge theological conflicts, like the rejection of the existence of a personal God, play the main role and made you feel foreign even to the rituals?
That's a very good question. I think again, when I was in Kathmandu, I was not a scholar or professor. I was teaching high school. And so I was not studying these things very deeply. And I loved going to the stupas, like in Bodhnath, Swambhunath, some of the festivals, Buddhist festivals, Tibetan monasteries, and so on. So it's not that I didn't appreciate it, but I think it seemed to me, at least in Kathmandu, it was really very different, and I found it hard to find connecting points. Many Christians, turn to the Buddha, and the Buddha becomes a Christ-like figure. And I think maybe that was less the case in Kathmandu when I was there, at least. And you have the Tibetan tradition of lamas and so on. So it was very complicated. And maybe wrongly or rightly, I found that, again, I made connections in my mind. Rama, Krishna are sort of like Jesus or like God. The goddess is sort of like the Virgin Mary. Those images in the temple are sort of like the saints. And I think I just was making easier connections between the Hindu way of religion and the Catholic way of religion that seemed to me personally more at home and more something I could relate to than what I was finding with the Buddhism. Later, I would then say, are there ontological or philosophical differences about nirvana or God, no God? And I think that would be lifetime's work to go, and many have done this, gone deeply into study of Buddhism from a Christian perspective. Somebody like Perry Schmidt-Leukel has done so much work on Buddhism, Mark Heim in America. looking into Buddhism. But that's a different thing. And I think I've always found more at home with the Hindu traditions.
Yeah. Would you think that at the first moment, it's important to have a kind of affection, empathy, emotional contact with the religion you're studying to get deep insights?
I think it certainly helps. I mean, sometimes I've known in missionary context, let's say Jesuits who seem to be told your job is to study Buddhism, or your job is to study Islam, or given the work and said, this is the work that you have to do. And that's one thing, like obedience, following what you're asked. But I think if you are young and if you want to say, I want to learn from another religion for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, then some kind of affection or some kind of enjoyment is important. And I think for me, even now, almost 50 years after I first encountered Hinduism, I love opening Hindu text. I love listening to the bhajans. I love going to the temple. And it stayed alive for me. And I think if it was only duty or only I have to do this, or it's only ideas, I would have stopped years ago. But it's still alive for me. And I think enjoying it. And therefore, if somebody is thinking, should I study Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, African traditions, whatever, which one has some, touches your heart, or which one has some emotional contact for you is a good place to start.
I agree very much with that idea. Thank you. So I continue with the chat. Have you had the experience that Hindu theologians have the same interest in the Christian religion as you have for Hinduism or in Hinduism?
I would say on the one hand, no. I mean, I've asked people thinking over the years, I can name so many Christians who have studied Sanskrit or Bengali or Tamil or Pali for the Buddhist texts and so on. It's almost impossible to think of Hindu theologians who've studied Latin or Greek, much less French or German. The idea of this serious study of the other, it's not that they're incapable, it's just that the level of interest is often not there. So it's not exactly parallel. And it may have something to do with the kind of the worldwide expansion of Christianity, Western Christianity in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, that this curiosity about the other was very strong, whereas people in China, people in India and other cultures maybe were less interested back to us. But I think also I would say that I would say probably the average Indian knows more about Christianity than the average American knows about Hinduism, because of the experience of the dominance of America and Europe and the British in the world, and also the colonial rule, the hundreds of years when the English and the French and the Dutch were ruling the Portuguese, parts of India. Like it or not, Christianity was impacting their consciousness. And so a lot of learning, not the deepest academic learning, but a sense of who the Christians are, what the Christians believe, who Jesus Christ is. Many more Hindus know that than asking a Christian, who is Rama, who is Sita? I have no idea.
Yeah. And do you have some Hindu theologians at Harvard whom you can include in your work? Do you invite sometimes Hindu theologians to do co-teaching or work with them?
It's not as developed. Like, I am always jealous of your program in Paderborn, where you have real Muslim thinkers and theologians present on your faculty and so on, which is wonderful. At Harvard, it's a complicated place, but we are changing things. We now have a program that will continue next year. It was last year and then again next year, of bringing in Hindu monastics, monks. So last year we had 2 men and 1 woman from different religious traditions, monastic traditions, and we'll have 3 more again next year. So these are kind of educated intellectuals in Hindu tradition visiting. They're not permanently on the faculty, but they are visiting. And then currently I'm team teaching a course with the Swami in Boston, Swami Tyagananda, the Ramakrishna Swami. He and I are teaching a course in our ministry program, which is usually Christian ministry. We're doing a course on introduction to Hindu ministry. And we're having speakers coming in. So tomorrow we teach again, and we have like two Hindu speakers from the UK coming in by Zoom to speak. So it's slowly getting started. I would say it's not terribly deep theology yet, but we're beginning to make it part of the life of Harvard to have these conversations. Islam is stronger. We have a number of Muslim scholars and practicing Muslims on the faculty. But with Hinduism, I think it'll over time, hopefully, catch up.
Take the next question from the chat. You said that comparative theology is really theology. There are voices in the German-speaking world that say comparative theology is not theology, but a method. Can you please explain again why it is more than questions of theological method for you?
Well, I would have to, maybe I could, we'd have to clarify maybe what exactly the idea of the method versus real theology is. But I think most theologians I know, when they write their books, they explain their method first and they talk about how they do it. And so a mark of comparative theology is to talk about learning from another tradition outside the Christian tradition. It has to be distinguished from comparative religion, history of religions, and so on. Therefore, you have to explain what comparative theology is. But I think in terms of the substance of it, when I see one of my fellow theologians, let's say at Boston College or Georgetown or Notre Dame doing Catholic theology, they're exploring the meaning of revelation, or they're exploring incarnation or grace or salvation. And I think when I'm looking into Hindu texts, I'm often looking into issues of nature of God, incarnation, revelation, grace, pointing to substantive issues that a theologian will notice, and then bringing that into some kind of dialogue with similar notions in the Catholic tradition. So it is a matter of method, defining how this is not the same as interreligious dialogue. This is not theology of religions. This is not comparative religion. But substantively, if a Hindu text is speaking about God's grace, then that creates the conditions for a theological conversation about God. What do you mean by God? What do you mean by grace? The course I'm teaching for our MDiv master's students now is called Krishna and Christ. And we're going through a series of themes in the course about the nature of Krishna, the nature of Christ. But we're in the section of the course now where we're really dealing with ethical issues. What is it? What are the ethical teachings of Jesus? What are the ethical teachings of Krishna and Bhagavad Gita? What does it mean to do imitation of Christ? What does it mean, would you want to imitate Krishna? And I think we're doing this briefly because it's only one course, but the theological issues of Christ and Christ's teaching, Christ's role in the world, avatar, incarnation, with Krishna, we're going back and forth through the semester. And it's not a history course, it's not a religion course, it's a theology course. Mm-hmm. And I think fairly basically, that's what we do. It's real theology, not just talking about method.
Yeah, and it really changes things when you take sources from other religions. That changes your theology. Yeah, I take the next question from the chat. Concerning the future of comparative theology in the context of secondary education, the confessional perspective plays a role in comparative theology and forms a basis for engaging with other spiritualities. How can I, as a teacher, deal with the fact that more and more students have only a weak or even no connection to any confession or to the confessional?
Would secondary education mean college level? Is that what that means?
Yeah, yeah. In Germany, the system, you would be between 10 and 18 years old when you're in the secondary.
All right, so, okay, so that's similar. I think, I mean, that is a big factor. When I started learning from Hinduism 50 years back, it was more traditional. So you're a Catholic, you're a Protestant, you're a Jew. Then there are others of other traditions, and you all know your own tradition. When I got to Boston College, Catholic University in 1984, I could still presume that most of my students had grown up Catholic and had probably at least some basic knowledge of the Catholic faith, knew the commandments, knew the sacraments, had been to church regularly, and so on. But over the years, even at Boston College, and now certainly at Harvard, which is very ecumenical, interreligious, but also secular and religious, and also the category of the spiritual but not religious student who wants to be spiritual but doesn't want to commit to some religion. That is very common. And so if I have 20 students in class, there may be 8 or 10 who you can tell they're a committed member of a tradition. And then the other 10, they're seeking, they're interested, they're not willing to commit. They know this and this and this, and they're looking around, which would mean for us that it makes education all the more difficult, because if you're doing comparative work, you can't presume that one half of it is already known and the other half is new. In a sense, both halves may be not new. I remember once years ago, even teaching a course, and we were using the Gospel according to St. Matthew and the Bhagavad Gita. And there were maybe 20 students in the class, and they were almost all Americans. More of them had read the Bhagavad Gita, and hardly any had actually read Matthew. They knew Matthew, they knew the story, they knew what happened to Jesus and so on, but they hadn't actually ever read the gospel. And so I think it's a problem of both in terms of a multi-faith pluralistic society, but also the lack of any coherent family or school education. When you get students in class, they may not know this, they may not know that. And therefore you have to be aware of teaching everything. But I find still, as I did 30 years ago at BC, that teaching the Hindu tradition can help the Christian students to rethink about the Christian tradition, which either they think they know and they don't know, or they've rejected because they thought it was not a good idea. Sometimes the Hindu opens the door to learning something from Christian. It's not ideal because it's our educational frame is too short. But at least there's the question of keeping the questions alive for students who will appreciate the comparative more than I'm just going to give you a catechism in your tradition. Students will close their eyes and not listen. But if it's comparative interreligious, they're more likely to listen, I find.
Yeah, it's true. And at least now they read first of the time the Gospel of Matthew in your course.
That's right. Yes.
That's something because of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yes.
It's fascinating. We only have time for one last question from the chat, but it's a good last question. It asks, and there are much more questions, so we see it was very stimulating what you said. As the leading figure of comparative theology, do you have any wishes for the future development of comparative theology as discipline?
Oh, that's a very good question. As I answer it, I would say that if there are any questions in the chat that people would like answers to, you could email them to me or something. Maybe I could follow up otherwise after this is over. But in terms of this question, I mean, I think it's become an interreligious problem related to the previous question, that in our pluralistic society here, let's say in the United States, more and more interreligious reality and fewer people who know anything in depth about their own tradition can lead to a certain kind of secularism or fanaticism, people going from one extreme to the other. And therefore, I think it's a matter of saying we have to be able to say that study, learning interreligiously are all the more important now than it used to be in the past, and therefore to go deeper into one's own tradition and others. Therefore, in a way, comparative theology has to change. Young people will do it differently, the next generation differently. But I think the necessity of learning your own tradition and then learning deeply from other traditions has to keep continuing. How we do that when the educational institutions are not necessarily very helpful will be a problem. But I think that, and then the other thing I would say is looking forward to, as you have in Paderborn, more Muslim theologians, Hindu theologians, Buddhist theologians. So it's not just Christians doing this, but over the next 50 years to see that people of many different faiths see the advantage of comparative learning as part of being a good religious person in the 21st century.
That was a very fascinating idea for the end, that then also comparative theology becomes a bit of collaborative theology of believers from different religions and denominations working together, developing things together. As always, this was very fascinating to talk with you, and I would like to continue it. I always have the feeling when we talk that we should continue, and I hope
definitely,
that also the students and colleagues who were with us also have the feeling, and that those 45 minutes went through very quickly. So thank you so much for your time in your lunch break, something like that.
Thanks, okay.
We start dinner now. So it was great with you. It was very nice to have you here. And to see the very nice Hindu background in your room.
Yes, on the wall behind me, I should say there are two pictures. One is Ramanuja, the great Hindu theologian, early 20th century painting. And the other one was a painting of Tibet given me by a Hindu student, a Buddhist student in Kathmandu 50 years ago.
Great. That's very good to know this, to keep this in mind. So thank you so much. Thank you for everybody for joining us and for your questions and discussion. And we will see each other again next month with ZeKK Live again, then in German. And then Johannes Süßmann, our colleague from History Department, will be the moderator. And he asked Barbara Traub, who's member of, also sie ist Mitglied im Zentralrat der Juden in Deutschland. Da weiß ich nicht, wie ich das jetzt richtig auf Englisch übersetze. Wir würden uns freuen, wenn wir Sie da wiedersehen. Vielen Dank fürs Kommen. Machen Sie es gut. Einen schönen Abend noch. Auf Wiedersehen.